The New York Marriott marquee glittered in the evening light, towering over Times Square with its polished glass facade. Inside, chandeliers poured golden light across the grand ballroom, where the annual CEO Networking Summit was in full swing. Waiters glided between tables carrying silver trays of wine, and every corner hummed with conversations about mergers, acquisitions, IPOs, and global expansions. I smoothed the wrinkles from my navy blue dress, the one I had bought 3 years ago on clearance at Macy's, and forced myself to sit tall. Around me, men in tailored suits and women in power dresses traded business cards with the ease of people who belonged in such rooms. I knew deep down I didn't belong. Or at least, that's what everyone, including my own family, wanted me to believe. My son, David Sullivan, had urged me to come. "Mom, you need to get out more," he'd said. "It'll be good for you to see how the business world really works." He had smiled nervously when he said it, as if he wasn't entirely sure himself. But the real force behind my attendance was Evelyn, my daughter-in-law. She had insisted I join them tonight. She'd said it with a sweet smile, the kind of smile that hid something sharp. Evelyn was 35, blonde, polished, with an MBA from Harvard and a confidence that filled any room she entered. She was the CEO of her own tech startup, and she wore her success like armor. She was everything I wasn't, and she never let me forget it. David stood by her side like a loyal shadow, dressed impeccably in a gray Armani suit. He had become the man Evelyn needed him to be, not the boy I once raised at our modest kitchen table in Chicago. My heart still remembered him at 8 years old, spooning Cheerios into his mouth while I rushed out the door for a night shift. That boy was gone now, buried under layers of corporate polish. I tried to focus on the stage where the keynote speaker was introducing the evening's guest of honor. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Richard Al-Mansouri, international investor and philanthropist, here to discuss global expansion opportunities." Polite applause echoed as Richard, a tall man in his 50s, with dignified posture and thoughtful eyes, stepped forward. He radiated quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to demand attention. It simply drew it. That was when Evelyn decided to make her move. She rose gracefully, heels clicking against the marble floor as she guided David toward Richard. I followed reluctantly, feeling like a child trailing behind. "Mr. Al-Mansouri," Evelyn said with her practiced networking smile. "I'm Evelyn Patterson, CEO of Patterson Digital Solutions. This is my husband, David Sullivan." Richard shook their hands warmly. His eyes then drifted toward me, and for a brief moment, his expression softened, acknowledging my presence. Before he could say a word, Evelyn's voice sliced through the air. "And this," she added, pausing for dramatic effect, "is Marian, David's mother." The way she said my name, flat, dismissive, made me sound less like a person and more like an inconvenient detail. I forced a polite smile. Richard nodded courteously. But Evelyn wasn't done. She leaned closer to him and laughed lightly, though her words were sharp enough to cut glass. "Marian doesn't really understand business," she said. "She never went to college, actually. She didn't even finish high school. We've been trying to find something for her to do with her time. Maybe some volunteer work, though." Evelyn tilted her head with mock sympathy. "I'm not sure what skills she could offer." Heat rushed to my face. The air around me thickened, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me. Conversations at nearby tables quieted. My chest tightened. "Now, Evelyn," David started, but his voice faltered, weak and unconvincing. He didn't defend me. He never did. The silence stretched. Evelyn thrived in it. She always did. "She doesn't have a diploma to hang on the wall," she continued, louder now so others could hear. "No professional experience. Maybe she should just grab a broom and find some real work instead of pretending to understand conversations she's not qualified for." The words crashed over me like a wave of humiliation. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to walk out, slam the door, escape the suffocating stares, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. All I could do was lower my gaze to my hands folded tightly in my lap. Evelyn's laughter lingered in the air, sharp and triumphant. David stood frozen, his silence another wound deeper than the words themselves. Around us, people shifted uncomfortably. Some pitied me. Most simply accepted Evelyn's version of who I was: irrelevant, uneducated, invisible. But one person hadn't moved on. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Richard watching me, not with disdain, not with pity, but with curiosity. His gaze lingered longer than it should have, like he was studying a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture. The evening carried on. Speeches resumed, glasses clinked, laughter returned. But I remained hollow, as though Evelyn had carved something out of me in front of all those strangers. On the drive home, the silence inside David's luxury sedan was louder than any humiliation. Evelyn scrolled through her phone, probably already drafting a LinkedIn post about her networking triumph. David gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing, not one word. "That went well," Evelyn finally murmured, her eyes still fixed on her glowing screen. "I think Mr. Al-Mansouri was impressed with our projections." David gave a distracted grunt. I stared out the window at the city lights flickering by. Every street lamp reminded me of how far I'd traveled from the life I once had, a life no one in that car knew about. When we arrived at my apartment, a small, one-bedroom place David had insisted I move into after his marriage, I climbed the stairs alone. Inside, the rooms were quiet, filled with modest furniture and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing the navy dress, and let Evelyn's words echo in my head. "Grab a broom, find some real work." Something broke inside me that night. But alongside the break came something else, something fierce. For decades I had silenced parts of myself, folding them away into the background while survival became my only focus. But Evelyn's cruelty had pressed too hard on an old wound, reopening something I had almost forgotten, who I used to be. I rose from the bed and walked to the closet. Pushing aside winter coats, I reached for a battered cardboard box hidden at the back. My hands trembled as I pulled it out and set it on the floor. Inside were fragments of another life, letters written in French, photographs from embassies overseas, certificates with seals of institutions Evelyn would never recognize but that once opened doors across the globe. Memories of a woman who had once stood confidently in rooms like the one tonight, only she hadn't been laughed at then. I traced the edges of an old photo, a young woman in her 20s, standing in front of the U.S. Embassy in Damascus, wearing a tailored suit, holding documents with steady hands. She looked like she belonged, because she had. Tears blurred my vision. Evelyn thought she knew who I was. David believed her version too. Everyone in that ballroom tonight saw only what she wanted them to see, an old woman who didn't matter. But Richard's eyes had told me something different. He'd seen through the act. He'd noticed. I placed the photograph back in the box and closed the lid. My heart pounded with a strange mixture of shame and anticipation. For the first time in years, I wondered, what if the story isn't over? What if I've only been living in the wrong chapter? The night after the conference, my apartment felt smaller than ever. The walls pressed in close, every piece of furniture a reminder of what I had lost. Evelyn's voice still echoed in my ears, sharp, mocking, unforgettable. She never finished high school. Maybe she should grab a broom. I had been insulted before, of course. Life has a way of teaching you how to stomach cruelty, but this was different. She hadn't just cut me down. She had made sure to do it in a room full of powerful people, people who would forever remember me as the mother who didn't belong. And David, my son, had let her. His silence was worse than Evelyn's cruelty. He hadn't lifted a finger to defend me. But what haunted me most wasn't Evelyn's smirk or David's silence. It was the lingering look in Richard Al-Mansouri's eyes, the way he'd studied me, as though I were more than what Evelyn painted me to be. That, and his phone call later, "We should talk." The words had been so simple, yet they cracked open a door I'd sealed shut for decades. By 3 a.m., sleep was hopeless. I sat at the kitchen table in the dim yellow light of the overhead bulb, a chipped mug of coffee between my palms. The steam rose like a ghost. On the floor sat the battered cardboard box I had dragged out from the back of my closet, the box I swore I'd never open again. Inside lay my real life. The first photograph on top made my throat tighten. It showed a young woman in her early 20s, dark hair neatly pinned, standing confidently in front of the U.S. Embassy in Damascus. She wore a crisp navy skirt suit, her portfolio clutched tightly in her hands. She looked like she belonged. That woman was me. I remembered the morning it was taken, the way the sun in Syria was harsher than any I'd known, how the embassy walls seemed to shimmer white under its blaze. I had just graduated from Georgetown with a degree in international relations, specializing in Middle Eastern studies. My father, a career diplomat, had been so proud. "You were born for this life, Marian," he'd told me. Languages had always been my gift: Arabic, French, Spanish, German, Portuguese, bits of Italian and Farsi, each one another key to another world. Words weren't just sounds to me, they carried history, emotion, entire civilizations. I could step into a room full of foreign dignitaries and sense not just what they were saying, but what they meant, what they feared, what they hoped. It was more than skill, it was instinct. And for a few bright years, it had felt like destiny. I dug deeper into the box and found another photograph. This one wasn't official or professional. It was Robert Sullivan, standing in front of a modest house in Washington, D.C., his tie crooked and his smile shy. Robert wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't polished or worldly. He was an accountant from Ohio, steady and reliable, the kind of man who found joy in routine. He'd walked into a training seminar one afternoon and walked straight into my heart. Robert had nothing to do with embassies or foreign languages. What he had was kindness, a patience I'd never known. When he asked me to marry him, it felt like stepping out of the endless race of diplomacy and into a small, safe harbor. We built a life together. And when David was born, Robert had asked me to step back from the travel, at least for a little while. "He needs you here," he'd said. I had agreed. Love makes those decisions easy. But life is cruel. I can still hear the phone call that shattered everything. I had been in the kitchen, the morning news flickering on the television, while Robert adjusted his tie for work. David, 6 years old, munched on his cereal at the table. When the phone rang, I answered with no suspicion, no fear. A woman's voice came through, carefully measured, carefully softened. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm so sorry to tell you this. A drunk driver, a red light, a lunch break that ended in disaster." Robert was gone before the ambulance arrived. In one phone call, my life collapsed. I was 28 years old, a widow, a mother, and suddenly a woman with no safety net. Robert's company explained that as a contract worker, he wasn't eligible for death benefits. We had no life insurance, no savings, nothing but bills. The consulting firm where I'd been working part-time tried to be patient. They held my position for 6 months, waiting for me to sort out childcare. But I couldn't afford childcare. I couldn't juggle the demands of travel with the demands of grief and motherhood. So the position was gone. And with it, the last threads of my professional life unraveled. That was how I became a cleaner. The first job I found was scrubbing floors in office towers downtown. Night shifts paid just enough to keep the lights on, and they let me be home when David needed me in the mornings. I'll never forget the sting of bleach on my hands, the endless humming of vacuums, the way fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I pushed a mop down deserted hallways. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd go back to my career when David was older, but temporary became permanent. I can still see David at 8 years old, looking at me with confusion and hurt. "Why don't we ever go to McDonald's like my friends?" he asked. "Why are you always tired? Why do you smell like chemicals?" I laughed it off then, but inside, the guilt hollowed me out. Other mothers volunteered at school plays, helped with homework, baked cookies. I stumbled in half asleep, too tired to do more than nod. And still, I kept going. By the time David turned 12, I had worked my way up to supervisor at the cleaning company. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to move us into a slightly better apartment and buy him the brand-name sneakers he craved. I told myself it was enough. The years blurred. I juggled 3 jobs during David's college years: nights at the cleaning company, weekends at a grocery store, occasional catering shifts whenever I could find them. I wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, made 1 bag of groceries last a week, and hid the truth from David when he called. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," I'd tell him. "Just focus on your studies." And when he graduated, when he landed his first tech job, I cried tears of joy. His paycheck was more in 2 weeks than I earned in 2 months. I thought, finally. The sacrifices had been worth it. But then came Evelyn. I had expected to love whoever my son chose. Instead, the first time I met her, I realized she had already decided what I was: an embarrassment. She walked into my modest apartment with her polished nails and designer shoes, scanning the room like an inspector marking flaws. "It's so cozy," she said, smiling tightly. When she asked about my background, I answered honestly: the cleaning, the long hours, the sacrifices. "How noble," she said, but the word dripped with condescension. It wasn't admiration, it was dismissal. From that day forward, she made sure to frame me as small, and David, my David, shifted under her influence. He called less, he visited less. When he did come by, he seemed embarrassed by the furniture, the neighborhood, even my stories. I became what Evelyn needed me to be: invisible, until last night. Evelyn's words at the conference had reopened wounds I thought were scarred, and Richard's eyes, curious, steady, had forced me to remember the woman in those photographs. I sat at the table until the sun rose, the box still open, papers and photographs scattered like pieces of a forgotten puzzle. Maybe Evelyn thought she knew me, maybe David believed her version too, but I knew there was more. There had always been more. And Richard's phone call, "We should talk," was proof that someone else had seen it too. The morning after those cryptic text messages, I woke before dawn, nerves buzzing beneath my skin like electricity. I hadn't slept much. My mind had churned with memories, doubts, and an aching question I couldn't shake. What did Richard Al-Mansouri see in me that no one else did? The city outside was still wrapped in early darkness, the streets damp from an overnight drizzle. I made a pot of coffee, poured it into a chipped white mug, and sat at the table staring at my reflection in the window. My face was pale, lined with fatigue, but there was something else there too, something I hadn't seen in decades: anticipation. By 8 a.m., I was already dressed, not in the Macy's clearance dress from the conference, but in my work uniform, navy slacks, a button-down shirt, and sneakers. My janitor's badge hung around my neck. The irony wasn't lost on me. If this meeting was real, if Richard truly wanted to see me, then I'd be stepping into the Ritz-Carlton lobby, wearing the very disguise that had buried my past for 20 years. But the text hadn't said, "Come dressed for success." It had said, "Don't be late." So I went. The Ritz-Carlton stood like a fortress of glass and steel over Michigan Avenue, its lobby a world of gleaming marble, hushed conversations, and the faint scent of polished wood and roses. I hesitated at the entrance, suddenly overwhelmed by the contrast. Everyone here carried themselves with the confidence of belonging. I felt like an intruder, and then I saw him. Richard sat in a quiet corner near the tall windows, a sleek leather briefcase at his side, a cup of coffee untouched before him. He looked exactly as he had at the conference, poised, dignified, watchful. When his eyes found mine, something flickered across his face. Recognition, relief maybe. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, rising as I approached. His voice was steady, warm. "Thank you for coming." "I almost didn't," I admitted, folding my hands tightly in front of me. "But you did," he said simply, gesturing to the chair across from him, "and that tells me more than you realize." For a moment, we sat in silence, the bustle of the lobby swirling around us like background noise. I felt the weight of his gaze, steady but not invasive, as though he were giving me space to decide whether to speak. Finally, he broke the silence. "The other night at the conference, when your daughter-in-law tried to humiliate you, I noticed something. The way you listened, the way you carried yourself. It wasn't ignorance I saw, it was restraint. You understood more than you let on." I lowered my eyes. "You're mistaken, I'm just—" "No," he interrupted gently. "You're not just anything. I've spent my entire life in international business. I know when someone understands what's being said between the lines. You do. And last night, when you spoke Spanish to your colleague at the law firm..." I stiffened. "You were there?" He nodded. "I had a late meeting with Harold Morrison. I heard you. And then, when I asked you a question in Arabic..." His eyes sharpened. "You didn't just answer. You responded with nuance. Classical Arabic, with a Syrian inflection. That isn't something you pick up from books. That's lived experience." Heat rose in my cheeks. My secret, exposed in an instant. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small leather portfolio I hadn't touched in years. Slowly, I placed it on the table and slid it toward him. "You're right," I whispered. "I wasn't always who they think I am." Richard opened the portfolio. Inside were letters written in multiple languages, certificates from international programs, photographs from embassies overseas. He studied each one with careful respect, not the detached curiosity of someone collecting gossip, but the attentive eye of someone piecing together a puzzle. "This is extraordinary," he murmured. "You were a cultural attaché?" "Briefly," I said. "Before Robert, my husband, died. After that, everything collapsed. I had no choice but to survive, and survival meant cleaning offices instead of sitting in them." Richard closed the portfolio and placed his hand on it, as though sealing it shut with reverence. "Mrs. Sullivan, the life you describe, it doesn't erase the knowledge you still carry. Culture doesn't vanish because you've scrubbed floors instead of signing treaties. If anything, your resilience makes you more valuable." I shook my head. "Valuable? To who? My son won't even look me in the eye without shame. My daughter-in-law treats me like an inconvenience. The world has no use for women like me." "On the contrary," Richard said firmly, "the world desperately needs women like you, which is why I want to offer you something." I blinked. "Offer me what?" "My company is expanding operations in the United States, but cultural misunderstandings kill more deals than faulty contracts ever will. I've interviewed consultants with degrees and accolades, yet none of them possess the lived fluency you demonstrated in a 30-second conversation. I want you to work with me. As a senior cultural consultant." My heart slammed against my ribs. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," he said, leaning forward. "Your expertise could save me years of missteps, and beyond that," he paused, his expression softening. "You deserve to be seen for who you are, not for who others decided you were." I couldn't breathe. My world, so small, so confined for so long, suddenly tilted open like a door I'd forgotten existed. But then the doubts rushed in. I haven't been in that world for 20 years. I wouldn't even know where to start. Business practices have changed. Technology has changed. I'd make a fool of myself. "Practices change," Richard agreed, "but respect doesn't. Relationship building doesn't. Cultural intelligence doesn't. Those truths remain, and you embody them." The lobby noise faded as his words sank in. For years I had convinced myself that the woman in those photographs no longer existed, that she had been erased by bleach stains and exhaustion. But now, here was someone insisting she was still alive. "Think about it," Richard said, sliding a crisp business card across the table. "I'll be in Chicago all week. Meet me tomorrow at Morrison & Associates. I want you to sit in on a meeting not as a janitor, but as a consultant. Observe. If you see something I've missed, speak, that's all." I stared at the card. The name, embossed in silver letters, felt heavy in my palm. "What if I fail?" I whispered. Richard's eyes didn't waver. "What if you don't?" I left the Ritz-Carlton with my pulse thundering in my ears. Outside, the Chicago morning had come alive, traffic roaring, vendors calling, the air filled with the scent of roasted coffee beans. The world looked different, brighter, as though someone had polished the glass. But beneath the brightness, fear gnawed at me. What if Evelyn found out? What if David did? What if stepping into that meeting tomorrow only proved that I was the fraud Evelyn claimed I was? Yet another voice whispered, louder than my fear, "What if this is your way back?" That night, I prepared as though my life depended on it. I dug deeper into the cardboard box, pulling out notes I'd scribbled years ago, articles I had saved, even foreign newspapers I'd hoarded at the public library. I stayed up past midnight reading, translating aloud to remind my tongue of its forgotten rhythms. By the time dawn painted the sky, I was trembling with exhaustion but also something else, purpose. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee grounds. The air conditioning hummed above the long mahogany table where half a dozen men in dark suits shuffled papers and tapped impatient fingers on their notepads. Their voices overlapped, sharp, clipped, full of numbers and deadlines. I froze in the doorway. For a heartbeat, I was 20 years younger, walking into a State Department briefing room in D.C. The posture, the tension, the quick calculation in their eyes, it was all the same. And for a terrifying second I thought, I don't belong here anymore. Then Richard rose from his chair. His calm presence cut through the noise. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is Mrs. Marian Sullivan. She'll be joining us today." The men turned to look at me, some polite nods, others skeptical frowns. I felt their unspoken question, who is she, and why is she here? Richard gestured to a chair beside him. "Please, have a seat." I crossed the room on legs that felt unsteady but determined. As I sat, my hands instinctively folded in my lap, an old habit of making myself small. But then I noticed my reflection in the polished table, pearls around my neck, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. I forced myself to lift my chin. The meeting began with the American team presenting a draft contract to expand pharmaceutical distribution into the Middle East. Their language was blunt, their tone transactional. "Speed is everything," one of the lawyers said, stabbing the paper with his pen. "We can bypass a lot of the local red tape if we push our FDA standards as the benchmark. Efficiency sells." Richard listened politely, his expression unreadable. I, on the other hand, felt my stomach tighten. I knew enough to recognize disaster. Their approach was not just arrogant, it was insulting. Across the table, I caught Richard glancing at me. Just a flicker, but enough. A silent invitation. "Do you see it too?" I swallowed hard. This wasn't my place. I was here to observe, not to speak. But then I remembered Evelyn's voice. She doesn't understand business. She should grab a broom. And I knew silence was no longer an option. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting across the chatter. The room stilled. 6 pairs of eyes landed on me, some surprised, some dismissive. Richard leaned back slightly, giving me the floor. I picked up the contract draft and flipped to the section on regulatory compliance. "You're suggesting using American FDA standards as the baseline," I said evenly. "But in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the regulatory process is often stricter than ours. They require additional studies, sometimes on genetic markers, sometimes environmental factors. Positioning American standards as superior will come across as condescending." One of the lawyers frowned. "And you know this how?" The old me, the one who had spent years scrubbing floors, would have shrunk under that question. But the woman in those embassy photographs rose inside me. "Because I live there," I said, locking eyes with him. "Because I've sat across tables from regulators who trained at Johns Hopkins, Harvard, the Mayo Clinic. They don't need America telling them what's rigorous. They need partners who respect their expertise and understand their patients' needs." The silence was thick. One man shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another tapped his pen against the table, less confident than before. Richard broke the silence. "She's right," he said simply. For the next 20 minutes, I spoke, not from notes but from memory. I explained cultural nuances, how relationships often mattered more than contracts, how trust was built over shared meals, how certain phrases carried weight far beyond their literal meaning. I told them that in the Middle East, negotiations weren't battles to be won quickly, they were conversations to be nurtured patiently. That a careless word could undo months of progress, while a gesture of respect could secure loyalty for decades. The men listened, some grudgingly, some with dawning comprehension. Richard never looked away from me, his expression a quiet mix of satisfaction and encouragement. When I finally stopped, the room was still. One of the younger lawyers cleared his throat. "So, what you're saying is that our entire approach is flawed?" I allowed a small smile. "I'm saying it needs to be reframed. If you want a partnership, don't treat it like a conquest." The meeting adjourned shortly after. The Americans left looking thoughtful, if not chastened. Richard gathered his papers slowly, giving the others time to leave until it was just the two of us in the room. "You see," he said softly, "you belong here." I exhaled a shaky laugh. "I was terrified the entire time." "You didn't show it," he replied. "You spoke with authority because you have authority. Don't let anyone, especially your daughter-in-law, convince you otherwise." I looked at him then. Really looked. His words weren't flattery. They were conviction. He believed in me more than I believed in myself. And for the first time in 20 years, I began to believe him. That evening I walked home differently. My shoulders no longer curved inward. My steps had rhythm, purpose. On Michigan Avenue, the city lights sparkled, and for once, I didn't feel like a shadow passing through them. I reached my apartment, pulled the cardboard box from under the table again, and spread its contents across the floor. For hours, I reviewed old notes, letters, articles in Arabic and French. The words flowed back into me like streams feeding a long, dry riverbed. I was remembering who I was. 2 days later, Richard called again. "There's another meeting," he said. "Different industry, different stakes. I want you there." I hesitated. "As what?" "As yourself," he said. "That's more than enough." The following week became a blur. Contracts, consultations, late-night reviews of cultural protocols. I sat in boardrooms not as a cleaner in the corner but as a voice at the table. Each time Richard asked for my perspective, and each time I gave it, something inside me straightened. The woman who had been invisible for so long was becoming visible again. But with visibility came risk. The voicemail wouldn't stop echoing in my head. "Mom, is it true? Why didn't you ever tell me who you really are?" I must have replayed it a dozen times, each word cutting deeper. It wasn't Evelyn's venom that haunted me this time, it was David's voice. Shaken, confused, hurt. The kind of hurt that comes not from betrayal, but from realizing your entire understanding of someone you love has been built on sand. I sat in the dark, the phone heavy in my palm, staring at the muted city lights outside my window. For years, I had chosen silence. For years, I let Evelyn narrate my life to my son because it was easier than fighting. Now silence had become its own kind of lie, one I could no longer outrun. By the time dawn broke, painting the Chicago skyline pink and gold, I knew there was only one path left. If David wanted answers, he would get them not filtered, not minimized. The full truth, for better or worse. We agreed to meet that evening at a diner off Michigan Avenue. Not Evelyn's world of white tablecloths and wine lists, but a greasy spoon with cracked vinyl booths, the kind of place where waitresses called you on and the smell of bacon never quite left the air. It was neutral territory. I arrived first. The Formica table was sticky beneath my hands, and the coffee tasted faintly burnt, but it grounded me. My nerves skittered in my chest like trapped birds. Every time the bell above the door jingled, my heart jumped. And then he walked in. David, my son. The sight of him hit me harder than I expected. He wore a tailored navy suit, his tie loosened, the polish of a man who had built himself a career. But up close, I saw the fatigue in his eyes, the lines etching his forehead too soon. Success had sculpted him into something sleek, but it had also hollowed out the softness I once knew. "Mom," he said, voice low, almost careful. I nodded. "David." He slid into the booth across from me. For a moment, silence stretched between us. The waitress came by, refilled my cup, and poured him a black coffee. Neither of us touched it. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice cracked. "I need you to tell me the truth." The words hung heavy, almost unbearable. I clasped my hands together to steady them. "What exactly do you want to know?" His eyes searched mine, frantic, wounded. "The article said you were advising international companies, that you speak 7 languages, that you worked in diplomacy. Is it true?" "Yes." He blinked, as though hoping I'd laugh, that I'd say it was some mistake. "All of it?" "All of it." He sank back in the booth, exhaling a shaky breath. His hand rubbed his temple. "All these years, I thought Evelyn told me you never finished school, that you worked cleaning jobs because you had no education, no options, and you just let me believe that?" "Yes." My voice was calm, but inside shame curled like smoke. His jaw clenched. "Why? Why would you let me think my own mother was it?" Cut himself off, but the word hung in the air. "Nothing." "Because survival leaves no room for pride," I said softly. He shook his head. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have," I replied. My voice hardened. "Do you remember when your father died? You were 6. I was 28. One phone call and everything collapsed. No life insurance, no savings, a pile of medical bills I couldn't pay. My consulting firm held my position for 6 months, but without childcare, I couldn't travel. And without travel, I was useless to them. I lost everything overnight." David's eyes flickered, guilt tugging. I scrubbed toilets so you could have shoes without holes, I continued, my throat tightening. I worked 3 jobs so you could stay in school. I told you everything was fine so you wouldn't feel the weight crushing me. And in all of that, how was I supposed to say, by the way, I used to advise diplomats and CEOs? What good would that truth have done you then? He stared at me, speechless. The waitress set down plates for another table, and the sizzle of bacon filled the air. But our booth was a world apart, vibrating with unspoken pain. Finally, David whispered, I thought you were ashamed. Tears stung my eyes, but I held them back. I wasn't ashamed of who I was. I was ashamed of what I couldn't give you. I let Evelyn paint me small because I didn't have the strength to keep correcting her. And I let you believe her because I thought maybe it was easier than dragging you through my failures. He bowed his head, hands trembling around the coffee cup. God, Mom. I let her treat you like dirt. I let her make you invisible. What kind of son does that? For the first time in years, I reached across the table. My hand covered his, warm, steady. A son who trusted the wrong voice, a son who forgot to ask questions, but also a son who can change. His eyes lifted to mine, shining with tears he refused to let fall. I don't deserve forgiveness. This isn't about forgiveness, I said gently. It's about choice. What will you do now? We sat there for hours, peeling back years of silence. I told him about Georgetown, about the embassies, about his grandfather's diplomatic life. I told him about Robert, about the accident that gutted our future, about the long nights cleaning offices and the aching loneliness I never let him see. And David listened. Really listened. The arrogance fell away, replaced by the boy I once knew, the boy who used to press sticky peanut butter fingers into my palm and say, Don't worry, Mom, we'll be okay. When the words finally slowed, when the silence grew gentle instead of sharp, he said it, I'm leaving her. The words landed heavy, final. What? Evelyn, I can't stay. I thought she made me stronger, but she just made me ashamed of where I came from, of you. Now that I know the truth, I can't live in that lie anymore. My chest ached, a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. Divorce wasn't victory, it was fracture. But maybe sometimes fracture was the only way to heal. I don't need Evelyn's apology, I said quietly. And I don't even need yours. What I need is to never again be treated as invisible, not by you, not by anyone. David nodded slowly, the weight of my words pressing into him. You won't be, not again, I promise. We left the diner hours later. The neon sign buzzed overhead, the night air sharp with the smell of rain. As we stood on the sidewalk, David looked at me differently, not as the burden Evelyn had described, but as someone he'd underestimated for far too long. What happens now? He asked. I smiled faintly. Now I stopped pretending. Back home, exhaustion tugged at me, but a lightness bloomed in my chest. The years of silence between us weren't erased, but for the first time, they weren't walls anymore. They were cracks letting light in. I curled on the couch, phone on the table beside me, and closed my eyes. For once, sleep came. The voicemail had already frayed my nerves, but the text was worse. We need to talk. Tonight, come alone. If you don't, everyone will know the truth about you. The words burned into my mind, looping until I couldn't tell whether I was imagining them or if they had carved themselves permanently into the walls of my apartment. The kettle whistled on the stove, but I barely heard it. All day, I'd paced the floor, trying to convince myself it was a prank. But no, something about the voice, about the tone, had been too precise, too personal. Someone knew me. Someone wanted me cornered. And the worst part, which truth were they talking about? The languages? The embassies? The life I had buried under 2 decades of bleach and exhaustion? Or something darker, something I hadn't faced even in my own memory? At 6 p.m., another buzz. A text this time, 8 p.m. Navy Pier. Don't bring anyone. Don't be late. I sat heavily at the kitchen table, my coffee growing cold. Navy Pier, crowded enough for anonymity but dangerous in its sprawled dark corners, water yawning below. Whoever sent this knew what they were doing. I should have deleted the message. I should have called Richard, or even David, but I didn't. Because the truth is, I was tired of running from shadows. For too long, Silence had been my shield. If someone thought they could weaponize my past against me, they were going to find a different woman than the one Evelyn had tried to humiliate at the conference. By 7:30, I was out the door. The Chicago air bit sharp against my cheeks as I walked briskly toward the lakefront. Streetlights flickered, casting fractured shadows across the pavement. The closer I got, the louder the city became. Families clustered near food vendors, children clutching cotton candy, laughter mixing with the creak of the Ferris wheel. Navy Pier on a Saturday night was alive, buzzing, but beneath the music and chatter, I felt the undercurrent of menace. Every face seemed to linger too long, every shadow seemed to stretch too far. At exactly 8, my phone buzzed again. End of the pier. Bench by the Ferris wheel. Sit, wait. My chest tightened. My heels clicked against the wooden planks as I made my way past the food stands and souvenir shops. The Ferris wheel loomed above me, its cabins glowing red, blue, and white against the black sky. I found the bench. Saturday waited. Minutes dragged like hours. And then, footsteps. The figure that approached was elegant, deliberate, blonde hair twisted into a bun, trench coat cinched at the waist, heels tapping out a rhythm of confidence. When she stepped into the Ferris wheel's glow, my stomach dropped. Evelyn. She slid onto the bench beside me, perfume sharp in the night air, her smile thin as glass. You came. I kept my voice flat. You sent the message. Of course I did, she said smoothly. You didn't think I'd stay quiet while you played dress-up as some international consultant, did you? Her words curled with venom, but beneath them I caught it, the tiniest tremor, a desperation she couldn't quite mask. What do you want, Evelyn? Simple, she said, crossing one leg over the other. I want you to stop. Stop this ridiculous act. Step back into your little corner where you belong. Because if you don't, she leaned close, her breath hot against my ear. I'll tell everyone what you really are. My jaw tightened. And what exactly am I? She leaned back, eyes glinting. A fraud. A cleaning lady who decided to spin a tragic story into a career. Do you think these CEOs will still take you seriously once they hear you spent 20 years with a mop in your hands? Once they learn you let your own son believe you were uneducated? Her words struck like knives, but instead of bleeding, something inside me hardened. I didn't pretend, I said firmly. I survived. There's a difference. Her mask cracked, just for a moment. She recovered quickly, lips curling into a smirk. Semantics, perception is reality, and I control the perception. Imagine the headlines, consultant hid janitorial past for decades. The very people praising you now will laugh you out of the room. I met her gaze. Why? Why does it matter so much to you what I do with my life? For the first time she faltered, her voice sharpened, brittle. Because David sees you differently now. He questions me. He questions our marriage. And if he leaves, her hand clenched into a fist. If he leaves, it will be your fault. The admission hung heavy between us. This wasn't just about me. It was about power, control, fear. I didn't destroy your marriage, I said quietly. You did by building it on shame and superiority. Don't put that on me. Her eyes flashed. If he leaves, you'll regret it. I stood then, every nerve taut, but my voice steady. No, Evelyn, I won't, because I won't live in fear of you anymore. Her expression flickered with rage, then quickly smoothed into icy calm. She rose, adjusted her coat, and with sharp, deliberate steps, melted back into the crowd. I stayed on the bench, heart racing, letting the lights of the Ferris wheel blur above me. She thought she had power, but all she had were chains I had already broken. I walked home slowly, the night colder now, but my spine straighter than it had been in years. Evelyn's threats no longer terrified me. They only proved she was losing control. Yet deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. People like Evelyn never retreat quietly. Fear makes them reckless, dangerous. I reached my apartment, closed the door, and leaned against it, exhaling the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. On the table sat Richard's business card, the silver letters catching the dim light. Tomorrow, I decided, I would tell him everything. Not just about Evelyn, but about my decision. I wasn't going to hide anymore. The message glowed on my phone like a warning flare. She's not the only one who knows. If you want to keep the rest buried, meet me tomorrow, alone, Millennium Park, noon. The rest. The words rattled around in my head long after midnight, sharper than Evelyn's threats. She had wanted to embarrass me, to reduce me back to the woman she could control. But this was different. Whoever had sent that message believed there was something worse, something I hadn't admitted to Richard, to David, maybe not even to myself. Sleep never came. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee gone cold, staring at the city skyline through the blinds. Millennium Park, noon, a public place, but vast. Too many angles, too many shadows. I thought of ignoring it. I thought of blocking the number. But no, the threat pulsed too close to my chest. If someone out there was determined to twist my story, I needed to know who, and what they thought they had on me. By late morning, the air had turned brittle, the kind of early spring cold that slid under coats and pricked at skin. Chicago bustled as if nothing had shifted, but my stomach churned with unease as I made my way downtown. Millennium Park stretched wide before me, glass towers reflecting sunlight above the skeletal trees. Tourists clustered around the bean, snapping photos. Office workers hurried past with paper cups of coffee. Children laughed as they darted between the fountains. To everyone else, it was an ordinary day. To me, it was a reckoning. At 11:58, I stood near the giant silver curve of Cloud Gate, my breath fogging in the chill air. My eyes scanned every face. A man in a navy parka leaned against a lamppost. A woman in sunglasses scrolled through her phone. A jogger stretched at the fountain's edge. Any of them could have sent the message. Then my phone buzzed. Bench near the Crown Fountain. Sit. Wait. I walked carefully, every nerve alive. The fountain was still off for the season, its glass towers dark, looming. A wooden bench sat in the shadow of the towers. I sat, my hands folded tightly in my lap, and waited. 5 minutes, 10. My pulse drummed in my ears, and then footsteps. A man in his early 50s approached, his hair silvering at the temples, his suit expensive but worn at the cuffs. He stopped a few feet away, studying me with dark, steady eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said at last. I didn't recognize him. "Do I know you?" I asked, forcing my voice not to tremble. "You should," he said quietly. "My name is Alan Mercer. I was with the State Department. We worked together before Damascus." The ground tilted beneath me. Memories rushed back like floodwater. Alan Mercer, yes, a junior officer, quiet but sharp, who had shadowed our cultural attaché team. I hadn't seen him in more than 20 years. "What do you want?" I asked. His expression was grim. "To warn you, because what you've stepped back into, it's not just about contracts and cultural nuance. It's about people who remember things you'd rather forget." I stiffened. "What things?" Alan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The negotiations in Damascus, the deal that went wrong. You weren't just translating, Marian. You were in the room when promises were made, promises that never should have been. Some of those people never forgot. And now, with you in the spotlight again, they're watching." My breath caught. Damascus, the embassy, the late nights, the frantic meetings, the deal that collapsed under the weight of corruption and betrayal. I had buried it so deep, even David didn't know. "You think they'll come after me?" I whispered. Alan's eyes darkened. "I don't think. I know. Evelyn's petty threats are nothing compared to what's coming. If certain names surface, if the truth about those negotiations resurfaces, it won't just ruin your consulting career, it could put you in danger." My hands clenched in my lap. "Why now? Why me?" "Because you've made yourself visible again," he said simply. "For 20 years you were invisible, safe in a way. Now people see you, and not all of them are cheering." I looked away, watching a child chase pigeons across the plaza. My chest tightened. For years, invisibility had felt like punishment. Now, I wondered if it had been a kind of protection. "What do you expect me to do?" I asked. "Be careful," Alan said. "Choose your allies wisely. Al-Mansouri is powerful, but even he can't shield you from every consequence. And David," he hesitated, "he deserves the truth too. All of it. Not just the parts you're comfortable sharing." The words hit hard. David. My son, who had only just begun to see me clearly, who had begged me to explain the pieces of my life I'd hidden. Could I give him this truth too? Could I tell him I'd once been entangled in a negotiation that had nearly blown apart alliances? I turned back to Alan, but his expression had shifted, watchful, almost pitying. "Why are you here, really?" I asked. He studied me for a long moment. Then, "Because I still owe Robert. He helped me once, more than you know, and I don't want his wife caught in a storm she doesn't see coming." The mention of Robert, my husband, long gone, sliced through me like glass. "You knew Robert?" Alan nodded. "Briefly, but enough to know he believed in you, and if he were here, he'd tell you the same thing I am. Be ready, the past never stays buried." Before I could respond, he glanced at his watch. "I've said what I came to say. The rest is up to you." He stood, adjusted his coat, and disappeared into the flow of pedestrians before I could ask another question. I sat frozen on the bench long after he left, the cold seeping into my bones. My mind raced, replaying his words, the warning, the shadow of Damascus stretching over me again. For years, I had thought my silence was choice, but maybe it had been survival all along, and now that silence was shattered, the past was rising like smoke from a fire I thought long extinguished. The message glared back at me from the phone screen. "You met him. Good. Now it's my turn. Tomorrow 10 a.m., same place. If you care about David's safety, don't be late." My hand trembled so violently I almost dropped the device. David, my son. His name pulsed like an open wound in the text, a direct shot into the only place I was truly vulnerable. I'd endured Evelyn's cruelty. I'd endured years of invisibility, but a threat against David was something else. Something primal surged inside me, the fierce, unyielding fire of a mother who would not, could not, let her child be touched. Sleep that night was impossible. I sat awake on the couch, phone clutched in my hands, heart pounding against my ribs. Every sound outside made me jolt, the squeal of brakes, the slam of a car door, the footsteps echoing down the hall. My mind conjured images of David caught in some shadow I couldn't reach. By dawn, I knew I would go. I had no choice. At 9:30 a.m., I was already at Millennium Park. The sky was overcast, gray clouds pressing low, as if the city itself were holding its breath. My coat flapped in the wind as I crossed the plaza, the bean reflecting a warped version of me in its curved silver surface. I scanned every face, every passerby, mothers pushing strollers, tourists snapping photos, businessmen on phones. Which of them wanted to hurt me? Which of them dared to threaten my son? At 9:58, another text. "Crown Fountain, stand by the North Tower." I obeyed, my pulse drumming in my ears. The towers loomed like silent sentinels, their glass dark. I stood stiffly, resisting the urge to bolt. And then, he appeared. A tall man in his late 50s, trench coat whipping in the wind, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. He moved with precision, like someone accustomed to command. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I caught the faint scent of cologne and tobacco. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said. His voice was gravelly, deliberate. "Who are you?" My voice shook, but I didn't lower my gaze. "Someone who remembers Damascus," he replied, "and someone who knows the cost of secrets." My chest tightened. Again, Damascus, that cursed word dragging the past into the present like a ghost I couldn't bury. "What do you want?" I demanded. He tilted his head. "Leverage." Rage flared, battling with fear. "If this is about money, I don't have any worth your time." He shook his head slowly. "Money is too small. This is about information, about what you know and what you're willing to keep quiet." "I don't know anything," I snapped. "Not anymore." "You were in the room," he countered. "When deals were made, when promises were broken. You think people forget that? You think governments forget?" My throat tightened. Memories slammed back. The embassy's cramped conference room, the heated arguments, the moment a handshake collapsed into chaos. The shame of knowing my translation had carried words that betrayed trust. "You've mistaken me for someone who matters," I said, my voice cracking. His mouth curved into a humorless smile. "On the contrary, you matter because you're visible again. You've stepped out of the shadows. That makes you dangerous." My hands balled into fists at my sides. "If you touch my son—" "Relax," he interrupted smoothly. "This isn't about harming him. It's about ensuring you cooperate. But accidents happen. You wouldn't want him caught in one, would you? The chill in his voice turned my blood to ice. What do you want me to do? Simple, he said. Convince your new friend Mr. Al-Mansouri to walk away from the next deal. You'll know which one. Stay close to him. Influence him. Make him hesitate. I stared, stunned. You're using me to sabotage him. Think of it as balancing the scales, he said. He's not the savior he pretends to be, and neither are you, but together you could be a problem. Better to stop it now. The wind whipped harder, rattling the bare branches overhead. My heart thundered. And if I refuse? The man leaned in, lowering his glasses just enough for me to see his eyes cold, unblinking. Then David learns the cost of your pride. I froze, my breath strangled in my chest. This was no bluff. He believed every word. We stood in silence for what felt like a lifetime, the city bustling indifferently around us. A child laughed nearby, the sound piercingly innocent against the weight of his threat. Finally, he stepped back, sliding his glasses into place. You have 48 hours. Think carefully. And then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd, leaving me trembling in the shadow of the fountain towers. I wandered the city for hours after, unable to return home, unable to face David. The threat pressed against my ribs like a knife, each step heavier than the last. How could I tell him? How could I admit that my past hadn't just cost me my career but might now endanger his life? By dusk, I found myself in a small church off Michigan Avenue, its doors open, candles flickering in the dim sanctuary. I sat in the last pew, hands clasped, though I hadn't prayed in years. Please, I whispered, voice breaking. Don't let them take him. Let it be me instead. Tears slid down my cheeks, hot and silent. For the first time in decades, I felt small again, not invisible but desperate. When I finally returned to my apartment, David was waiting. He rose from the couch, eyes searching my face. Mom? Where have you been? You look... He stopped, frowning. What's going on? I wanted to tell him everything, to confess the message, the meeting, the threat that now loomed over both our heads, but looking into his tired, worried eyes, I faltered. He had only just begun to see me as more than Evelyn's version. Could I shatter that now with the truth? So I lied. I was out, just needed time to think. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, though I could see suspicion flicker behind his eyes. Mom, he said gently, whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. My throat tightened, but I forced a smile. I know. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at a blank page. A choice loomed: comply with the man's demands and betray Richard's trust, or refuse and risk David's life. Both paths led to destruction. And yet, somewhere deep inside, another voice stirred, a voice I hadn't listened to in years. You've survived worse. You don't bend. You fight.